Hello, welcome to the first session of the year of the new lecture series at CJS. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Mary Brinton. She's a preeminent scholar of gender stratification and labor market organization with special focus on Japan and other East Asian societies. She is currently Reischauer Institute Professor of Sociology at Harvard University after her years teaching at University of Chicago and Cornell University. Her work on the role of female labor force in Japan's economic miracle combines sophisticated statistical analysis and fieldwork and interviews, in-depth qualitative analysis, and her 1993 book, Women and the Economic Miracle, is a classic. It continues to be the yardstick against which research on gender and work in Asia and in general is measured. And she has published many other articles in top sociology journals and top Asian studies journals. And she has edited many important volumes on gender and work and economic sociology, including a 1998 volume, The New Institutionalism in Sociology. In 2001, she co-edited Women's Working Lives in East Asia. In 2007, The Declining Significance of Gender. Well, there's a question mark, the declining significance of gender. And her research has been funded by all of the prestigious foundations that you can think of: National Science Foundation, Social Research Council, Center for Global Partnership, Spencer Foundation, Fulbright, Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And her current research focuses on school-to-work transition of Japanese youth, which used to be considered one of the strengths of the Japanese economy, but has become problematic with the recent, well, it's been a while, but the recent economic recession in Japan. And her research also speaks to the heated debate in Japan, the Japanese media and academia, as well as in the parliament, in the Diet, about the widening inequalities in what was once considered to be, was a myth, but considered to be an egalitarian Japanese society. Her book, which is scheduled to come out later this year, from Cambridge University Press, is entitled Lost in Transition, Youth, Work, and Instability in Post-Industrial Japan. If you're impatient about reading books, it's the Japanese version is already out. You know, all these big acts in music, Mariah Carey's of the world, they released their album first in Japan and then the US. It's like that. So she's that important. And we have the privilege of having a sneak preview of the book today. And without any further ado, please help me welcome Mary Brinton.
I think that's probably the first and last time I'll be compared to Mariah Carey. So I have to enjoy that for the moment. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm really pleased to be here and connect with a lot of friends and acquaintances from the past and meet new people. And as Kyo said, the title of my talk is Lost in Transition. Once in a while, people misprint it and put Lost in Translation, but the transition part is really important, as you'll see, I hope. Young workers in Japan's changed employment landscape. Foreign visitors arriving in Tokyo, I think, can be forgiven for not immediately seeing the kind of havoc that was wreaked on individual lives by the economic recession and employment restructuring of the late 20th century. We all know about the bursting of the real estate and financial bubble in the early 1990s and the fact that it led in the ensuing decade to the highest unemployment rates Japan had had since the early post-war period and the greatest economic anxieties that had been experienced since the early post-World War II period. And then, while the country was still struggling to recover, financial crisis hit once again, thanks Jennifer, hit once again in the fall of 2008 once again hitting Japan and striking down every other post-industrial economy in the world, and sending unemployment rates, which had begun to stabilize in Japan, sending them back up again. But even despite this, you can walk down the street in Tokyo's central business district and still see middle-aged salarymen rushing to their appointments. You can stroll past upscale kisaten in Tokyo's major shopping districts and see glimpses into the elegant world of upper middle-class housewives enjoying gossip and lunch together. And these, of course, are the sights that became so familiar to us in Japan's period of sustained economic growth prior to the 1990s. And when you see these scenes, you can think, not so much has changed in Japan after all. There's a reason that these scenes mask the impact of economic recession and employment restructuring. And it's because those who were the most affected were not the middle-aged or the elite. Instead, I argue that the people who have been most affected and lost in transition as the Japanese economy has tried to restabilize itself in the early 21st century are people in the younger generation, and especially the non-educational elite among them. So in my forthcoming book, which Kyo has so graciously introduced, I tell the story of this group of people, these individuals, and I analyze why so many of them have become lost in the transition from school to work, as Kyo said, and in a larger sense, I argue, really lost in Japan's transition to a mature post-industrial economy. So, as Kyo said, I published the book very purposely, first in Japanese, because I wanted to reach a broader audience. This was a wonderful experience, which I could talk about at length, but I won't have time to. And here's just the little ad, but Kyo's already provided the ad. So it'll be out hopefully by the end of this year from Cambridge. And in this book, I really deal with three central questions. What are the social and economic forces that produced a lost generation in Japan, and which members of the lost generation are really lost, and why? Is it those particular people? And then, of course, what are the prospects for the future of the lost generation? When I started working on this project, it was more years ago than I care to report, and I began the research really to answer this question that Kyo mentioned about why Japan's so-called, successful school-to-work system worked so well. And I started out in the mid-1990s doing interviews with teachers at public urban high schools in Japan. And I visited 20 high schools in Kanagawa and Miyagi prefectures. And those initial interviews really formed the original basis of my research. But those interviews showed me and convinced me that Japan's highly admired high school-to-work system was buckling under many pressures, and that increasing proportions of young people were leaving high school with no clear destination, neither higher education nor a job. And I'll tell you a quick story. By the late 1990s, I was being invited, as happens to all of us, to present my initial research. Sometimes you feel like you've barely started your research and you get invited to talk about it at Japanese universities when you're in the country. So I was being invited to speak about this early research at Japanese universities and research institutes. And when I discussed the results of my interviews with high school guidance teachers, many members of the universally highly educated elite Japanese audiences looked at me as if I was talking about the moon. They reacted as if I were talking about a place so foreign that it could not possibly be Japan. Why was this? Because I was describing to them high schools where as many as 30 to 40% of graduating seniors neither went into jobs nor into higher education, nor did they become ronin. I'd visited schools where teachers coached students intensively on how to interview for a job, but after 2 or 3 failed interviews, students simply gave up and took themselves out of the running for either jobs or for higher education. I described schools where teachers faced a classroom of students sleepy from having come to school from their nighttime arubaito at local kombini or other places, now absolutely ubiquitous in urban Japan. And I discussed schools where teachers said things were going well if they were able to cover even 1/3 of the pages of the nationally required curriculum. So scholarly audiences were surprised and shocked by what I was describing. And when I was first seeing this situation, again in the mid-1990s, my vantage point was very much through the eyes of the teachers that I was interviewing. And these were teachers at, I can go into more depth in the Q&A if you want me to, but they were teachers at middle to low-ranking public general high schools and vocational high schools, especially industrial high schools. And it was really these teachers' narratives that were so shocking to my Japanese audiences. Later, of course, what I realized was that I had been hearing a prelude to what would develop by the early 21st century into a frenzied public discourse in Japan about unemployed youth, part-time employment, job hopping, so-called parasite shinguru, and nito. But terms such as NEET were not commonly used before 2000, and neither the teachers I interviewed nor I really had any language we could easily call upon at that time to describe the troubling phenomena that were appearing. As we reach the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the situation that developed in Japan during the 1990s so-called ice age of employment may still not be apparent on the streets of Tokyo, but it is highly apparent when one walks into Japanese bookstores. In the past several years, the poor employment prospects for Japanese young people, again, especially the least educated among them, who are high school and junior high school graduates and dropouts, have become a topic of intensive study and discussion in the media and among prominent Japanese economists and sociologists. As Kiyo mentioned, so too have discussions of kakusa shakai, unequal society, nito, and most recently the working poor, walking poor, a term borrowed from the books of the sociologist William Julius Wilson and others who write about American urban poverty. So my book explains how and why a disproportionate share of the non-elite among Japan's younger generation has gotten lost in the transition from school into the workplace. And I argue, and this is partly why I wanted to publish the book in Japan as early as I could, because I argue that this transition that's become very rocky on the individual level mirrors the larger transition of the Japanese economy into a mature post-industrial economy with much more insecure employment relations than were dominant throughout much of the post-war period. There are 3 themes that I'm going to emphasize today. I obviously can't summarize the whole book, so there are important pieces that I'm going to not be able to get to, but I trust that you'll ask me later. The themes that I want to emphasize are, and I'll spend quite a bit of time on this, are that the youth employment patterns that we see in Japan today represent a much stronger rupture from the experiences of the generation preceding them than is the case in many other countries. Secondly, these patterns, despite the fact, especially since I was introduced as a gender stratification person, although Jennifer assures me it's okay to work on men, even if you're a gender stratification person, these patterns, I argue, represent a very significant degendering of the labor market for young people. Basically, many young people have been pushed to the periphery of the labor market. In other words, it's not just women anymore. Now it's young men, too. And this is a very important social fact, social phenomenon for Japan. And third, young people are really, I argue, making a dramatic but necessary departure from many of the culturally taken for granted strategies dominant in the post-war period for how one was supposed to pursue economic and psychological security. They're making these changes because they have to make these changes. And this is partly due to the underlying institutional changes that are taking place, including the breakdown in school-to-work institutions. And I'm not going to go into, in the body of the talk, how the school-to-work system operated in detail, nor all the data that I use to show how it's broken down, but I'm very happy to talk about that later. I'm going to show you instead more of the results of the breakdown. So I contend that these three characteristics of Japan's post-industrial experience have important implications for individuals and long-reaching, far-reaching implications for the future of Japanese society. And these are the themes that I want to stress. So let me start with a story from my fieldwork in high schools to illustrate how young people's movement among what I'm going to call secure social locations was more or less smoothly orchestrated by social institutions prior to Japan's economic crisis of the 1990s. So here's just a very small snippet from an interview. A success is when we find a company for the student. This is what a teacher in the Shindo Shidobu, the guidance section of a low-ranking academic public high school in Kanagawa Prefecture, told me when I asked him what the school considers a successful outcome for a graduating senior. When I asked why this was the definition that he had, he replied simply, "Anshin dakara," because it's safe, secure, it gives peace of mind. Such a definition of success indicated that the school had fulfilled its task of placing the graduating senior into a company. And this is a task, again, as I can talk about more later if you'd like me to, this is a task assigned to it by Japanese labor law and Shokugyo Anteijo, the public employment security offices in Japan. The most important thing for this teacher and for all of the other teachers I interviewed was to find a good organization, a ba, or social location, for each student to move into in the next phase of his or her life. Success was not defined in terms of helping students find the type of work to which they felt they were most suited or most capable. Indeed, across the 20 high schools in which I conducted in-depth interviews of teachers, that type of definition never surfaced. As one teacher commented dryly, "We talk about young people becoming shakaijin, adult members of society, but what we really mean is that they become kaishain, company people." This well-managed transition of individuals from school into a company is really, I argue, a microcosm of the distinctive ways that post-war Japanese society was organized before the 1990s. It was important for people to become attached to a ba, a social location, important for their material success and economic security, and also for their identity and sense of well-being. And we can come back later. I keep telling you all the things I'm not going to talk about in detail. We can come back later to why I've chosen to resuscitate this term ba, which, of course, almost everyone will recognize from Nakane Chie. Actually, I'll tell you one reason, and that is because it really resonated with Japanese people I spoke with, and it even made its way into the title of my Japanese book. So the idealized process of the 1960s to 1980s, whereby Japanese young people moved out of the status of being a full-time student into the status of a worker or adult, shakaijin or kaishain, was heavily predicated upon the availability of full-time jobs in shokuba, in workplaces. So what happens when fewer and fewer employers recruit new graduates into full-time jobs, thereby bestowing upon them the status of full-fledged membership in the workplace. What happens when schools are no longer the important ba that's the launching pad that connects young people to this next stage in their lives? And in broader terms, what happens in a society when social institutions falter in their ability to help young people make the transitions that society still tells them are the principal ones they have to make in order to become successful adult members of society? Well, as we know now, in 1990s Japan, all of this came up for grabs. But the most immediate manifestations of the breakdown of Japan's finely tuned mechanisms for moving young people from school into the labor force at first was really a distraction from the deep underlying systemic changes. Why? Because what was the most visible at the beginning were the new lifestyles of young people. Greater movement across jobs, a greater propensity to move in and out of the labor force, of course, ever-lengthening period of time, often into one's late 20s or early or mid-30s, residing in the parental household. A seeming lack of interest in getting married and having children. The two hallmarks, along with full-time employment, of responsible and respectable Japanese adulthood. Social concern over these types of changing lifestyle patterns among Japanese youth in the 1990s was, of course, fueled at the end of that decade by the publication of sociologist Yamada Masahiro's Parasite Shingoru no Jidai. And as probably everyone knows, Yamada argued that Japanese young people hold fundamentally different values and preferences from their parents' generation. And in his view, young people could afford not to take work seriously because they were able to financially rely on their parents, continuing to reside with them. And this discourse very nicely dovetailed with the freewheeling image of Frita, referring to young people who move across jobs and even in and out of the labor force in an attempt to find a more fulfilling lifestyle than the one that their parents, and especially their fathers, had been shackled with in corporate Japan. But by the early years of the 21st century, a discourse emphasizing the adventurous, if spoiled, nature of young Japanese began to give way to a very sober recognition that it was really the 1990s decade of economic recession and employment restructuring, not youthful exuberance and disregard of social norms, that was responsible for rising youth unemployment and part-time employment. Genda Yuji's Shigoto no Naka no Aimai na Fuan, translated very awkwardly into English, a nagging sense of job insecurity. It sounds so much better in Japanese. But with the publication of that book in 2001, the discourse changed. Government bureaucrats, the media, and scholars started to pay more attention to the ways that employment restructuring, or as a labor economist or a sociologist would say, labor demand, had pushed young people to the periphery of the labor market. And spurred by Genda-san's research and that of a handful of other Japanese sociologists and economists, the recognition grew in Japan that many young people in the lost generation who had reached adulthood in the 1990s faced labor market conditions that rendered stable employment a mirage that they could not bring to life even if they wanted to. Fritahood increasingly took on a very hollow meaning. Increasing numbers of young people fell into the standard categories of disenfranchisement, such as the unemployed and the marginally employed, and new ways of categorizing young people's attachment or lack of attachment to the paid labor force also emerged. The possibilities of entering an economically secure location, or ba, have simply been disappearing. So I want to show you some data, aggregate data, that illustrate the magnitude of the worsening employment situation of Japanese youth. So let's start with a complicated, not complicated, but messy comparative graph. So this shows the change in unemployment rates for men aged 15 to 24, what we usually call young men, in Japan and a number of other highly industrialized countries, OECD countries. Japan doesn't look so bad. Japan is the dark squares at the bottom of the graph. So you see the increase in unemployment for young men in the 1990s, and then a decline through here. But Japan is down here. This is poor, who is this? Is this Spain? A lot of other countries are pretty bad. So maybe it's not so bad, right? And this is what kind of data that American sociologists like to look at to say, nothing different about Japan. Those are the people I have to talk to all the time. So, one could reasonably argue that while young Japanese males' employment situation deteriorated in the late 1990s and the present decade, their unemployment rates remained, at maximum 10%. Not so bad compared to a lot of other countries, right? Also, if we look at spells of long-term employment, it's become more likely for young men in Japan to experience a long spell of unemployment rather than a short spell. That's become, that tendency has increased over time, but there again, Japanese young men by no means fare the worst across post-industrial economies. But I would argue that such cross-national comparisons are much more relevant to social scientists than they are to the people who are actually affected. Why? For two reasons. Because I think that individuals are likely to have two different implicit bases of comparison. And one is the work lives of their parents' generation or the generation in between their parents and themselves, the cohorts in between their parents and themselves. And the other reason is that people are likely to compare themselves to others in the same age group around them. So for those reasons, I strongly argue that it's much more important to look at data internal to Japan, data that reflect the change in employment experiences for young people in the 1990s versus young people in prior decades, and also data that compare the experiences of young people in the same cohort, in the same young age group, but with different levels of education, different levels of advantage. If international data are relevant at all to understanding Japanese young people's subjective experience of work, what may be the most important is the speed of change, speed with which things have changed within Japan. And if we take this kind of feature of an international comparison into account, we can briefly revisit unemployment rates. So let me give you another statistic. Among the 20 OECD or highly advanced industrial economies for which data are available from the mid-1980s, only 1/3 of them, 7, experienced an increase in unemployment among young male workers by the middle of the present decade. And Japan was one of those. Among the 27 countries that have data on the duration of unemployment, Japan was only one of 7 countries where the percentage of youth experiencing long-term unemployment increased over the period. Even so, playing the devil's advocate, maybe we could just say, well, young Japanese are reflective or representative of all age groups in Japan. Everybody has suffered from the recession and economic restructuring. So my next set of graphs compares the experience of young men to older men. So here's the U.S. This is what unemployment rates look like in the U.S. High and variable. But what's distinctive about this? Okay, young people are at the top, right? But that's true in virtually any country. Young people are the most most adversely affected by economic downturns. But these lines are all parallel to each other, right? Unemployment goes up for young people. Well, it went up for the middle-aged and it went up for the older workers as well. Same is true in the OECD, parallel lines. This is Japan. So in Japan, you see these nice, low, comfortable unemployment rates, still pretty low, but look at the youngest age group. it diverges from the others. And Japan is also interesting, and I'll come back to this in just a moment. These are middle-aged workers. The other graphs, their unemployment rates were higher than older workers. In Japan, these are, I should say, middle-aged men, not women. This is gender specific. They're in pretty good shape. Older workers, not so good. Younger workers, the worst shape. Okay, so this is looks much more complicated than it is. It's changes in the average job tenure or length of time spent in the current job for Japanese men by age group. And here you see what I was referring to. You can see that in the younger age groups, between 85 and 2007, the length of time spent in the current job has been going down. Look at the older age groups. The length of time spent in the current job by men over age 50 has gone up. So in other words, middle-aged men are pretty much staying in their jobs. They're staying in longer and longer. Younger workers are staying in their jobs for a shorter period of time. And this is all jobs. This is not simply full-time employment. So a lot of this is reflecting part-time contract workers. I'm not going to show you the graph for the U.S., but the graph for the U.S. is completely different. In the U.S., in the most recent economic recessions, the length of time spent in the current job has gone down for everyone, across ages and across genders. In Japan, the length of time spent in the current job has gone down for young people. It's gone up for young men, gone up for older men. Why is that significant? It's significant because seniority is still related to wages in Japan. The lifetime employment system is not dead, and the longer you spend in a firm, the higher your wages are likely to be. So, and here's a final graph, and then we'll go back to words rather than numbers. This is the percentage of Japanese employees engaged in irregular work. So this puts together part-time work, haken, contract workers, anything that's not a full-time regular employee job. And here again, the age patterns are unmistakable. And the 15 to 19 age group is entirely high school, junior high school graduates and dropouts. And then 20 to 24 is here, and everybody else is down here. So huge increase in the percentage of young people engaged in irregular work. This is across men and women. I couldn't find it for only men. So basically, the effect of the post-bubble economic recession in Japan has been especially severe when we're looking across men for young men. Why? Japanese employers' response to economic recession since the early 1990s has been strongly influenced by the remaining rigidities of the so-called permanent employment system. Employers' main solution to the economic downturn was to maintain the jobs of middle-aged men and eliminate as many full-time entry-level jobs as possible, which they could do. Rather than advertising new full-time jobs, they didn't have new full-time jobs, and instead create more and more temporary and part-time jobs. So basically push more and more workers to the periphery, but it's primarily the young. And what's really different, I argue, about this recession compared to the oil shock recession of the 1970s is the effect on men, young men. You don't see this in prior post-war recessions in Japan. An example of a 2006 poll by Kei Danden of senior officials in charge of personnel management reported that 40% of employers said they were facing a shortage of workers. This was in 2006. But many companies stated their reluctance to move current young part-time workers into full-time employment status. And this is despite the fact that among approximately at that time 4.2 million part-time workers under age 35, over 70% stated their preference to work as full-time employees. The result, again, long-term employment has been largely preserved for middle-aged male workers and largely eradicated for young workers, especially high school graduates. Genda Yuji in Shigoto no Naka no Aimai na Fuan reported that 2% of the unemployed population in Japan, I believe in 2005, was university-educated middle-aged men. 2%. Now, there's a clear intergenerational trade-off here that has resulted in the production of large numbers of nito. Nito are technically defined as, it has to be technically defined, right, by the Japanese government. And it's technically defined as being between the ages of 15 and 34, not enrolled in school, not in the labor force, not actively looking for work, and unmarried. And they do that because they don't want to count married women, because presumably they have another paycheck to rely on, although not if they're married to an unemployed man. But anyway, so nito, the proportion of nito increases across the relevant age groups. For people in their early 20s, about 11 to 12% are estimated to be nito, and for people in their late 20s and early 30s, the rate is close to 20%. So if you go back and think about the unemployment figures I showed, there's kind of an ironic twist here, I think. Unemployment has, it went up to 10% or so for young men in Japan. It's come down a little bit. But I've shown you the rates of irregular work for young people. And then there's this whole population of nito who aren't working at all and aren't looking for work and are not in school. So again, unemployment is only one statistic. And to my mind, you have to take all of these statuses together, being unemployed or being nito or being in highly insecure employment, and then think about the economic picture rather than relying on, simply, for instance, the statistic of unemployment. As a scholar of gender, I never want to be in the position of arguing that men's jobs are more important than women's jobs. But again, I think that the degendering of irregular employment for young people in Japan is highly significant. And one of those reasons is that to the extent that Japanese society continues to operate on a kind of breadwinner ideology, if young men are not in secure employment, they're not going to get married and they're not going to have babies. And this is something that the Japanese government needs to pay more attention to, clearly. So I have lots more things to say, but I don't want to talk too long. So let me make just a few more points and then we can open it up. Japan's highly institutionalized school-to-work system has unraveled, and I argue that it's partly because of economic reasons. And again, I can talk about this at much greater length, but basically Japanese high schools and employers no longer cooperate with each other very much in terms of moving high school graduates into full-time jobs. There are some exceptions to that, which I can address. But the system has indeed broken down pretty severely. And employers, I argue, have really fed into this in an interesting and perverted kind of way, which is employers increasing utilization of high school students in arubaito. So even in the mid-1990s, at school after school I went to, I read Rollin's Japan's High Schools like every other good Japan scholar, and I knew what Japanese high schools were supposed to be like, But every high school that I went to, the teachers said, we either can't enforce the restriction that our students don't work, or we don't even have that rule anymore because it's so unenforceable. Basically, the students at the schools I visited, large numbers of them were working part-time. The teachers then tell the students not to put it on their Reischauer because employers will regard this part-time work as negative. So young people are caught in this very contradictory situation. They're out there working. Yeah, maybe they're not, doing jobs that are terribly demanding, but they're experiencing the real world. They're getting work experience. It's mainly for kozukai, to, go buy more music and so forth. But they are experiencing the world of work, but it doesn't count for anything. It counts against them. They're not supposed to tell employers they've had these experiences because they're supposed to have been full-time students so that they can become full-time workers. That sequence of life stages is still kind of mythic proportions, but it doesn't match reality any longer. So that's one mujun. Another mujun is that as employers have offered more and more work opportunities for high school students, the control of low-level high schools has virtually disappeared. These schools rested their authority. These are not shingakko. They rested their authority and control over students by saying, we provide the recommendation for you into a post-graduation job. If they can get a job when they're in high school and it seems kind of okay to them, they don't need the school anymore. And a number of high school teachers told me, we don't want students to fail. We don't want them to drop out. So we're going to let them graduate. So, but they don't need the school. These students don't need to rely on the school. So the amount of chaos within these schools is extraordinary, but highly understandable. The students aren't going to fail unless they really do something terrible. And the teachers have no carrot to offer because they're not providing introductions to full-time jobs. There are very few of them left. The employers don't want their students, and their students can get part-time jobs while they're in school. Of course, nobody's telling them that they're damaged goods. They're going to be damaged goods by the time they're 25 or 27 and they've had 5 to 7 jobs. So basically, the decline in the number of full-time jobs for high school graduates, the increase of the number of part-time jobs for high school graduates and high school students, I argue has really led to an increasing irrelevance of the school as a significant social location or ba for, again, the non-elite in Japan, and increasing irrelevance to high school for their future workplace. And in some ways, the workplace itself is becoming increasingly irrelevant because it's not necessarily a place you can rely on for a long period of time to take care of you. So my book is really about a lot of these underlying institutional changes, about the ways that employers talk about them, the ways that high school teachers talk about them, and the ways that some young people talk about them. And I argue late in the book that the institutional changes, I think, are profound enough in Japan that they're really making it necessary for young Japanese to develop new resources and strategies for navigating the labor market and for navigating their lives. And they are doing that. But many of their strategies are being heavily criticized by adults around them because they're not the strategies that the parental generation needed to use. There's obviously a great increase in job mobility, and in periods of non-employment, again, very significant for young men, a lengthening of the transition to adulthood. This is happening in many societies around the world. And an increase in income inequality in the young generation. And we don't have very much data yet on this, but data are beginning to come out that show the very real possibility of a widening income gap within the younger generation between the economic haves and have-nots. Why? Because high school graduates fared really well in Japan's manufacturing economy, high growth economy, and really well in an economy where blue collar workers in good companies had access to long-term employment. So the income inequality is coming, I argue, and the big questions, that are out there, I think, a couple of them anyway, there are many, many, but one of them is whether these non-elite young workers are going to be a permanently marginalized labor force in Japan as they age into their 30s and 40s. I mean, many of them are already in their 30s. Is that going to happen? Is the class structure going to change and kind of solidify or not? And another question is whether in the experience of navigating this very tumultuous labor market, will many of these non-elite young workers have been able to develop the skills that are required in a fluid, what we call external labor market, skills that are useful and necessary for changing jobs. And in the book, I go deeply into how those skills have not been ones that have been taught in the educational system to date. They're not ones that have been very needed when one had the security of being in one company for a long time. And I contrast ways of job searching between Americans and Japanese and show the very distinct differences. Again, I can talk about that. It's a more social psychological part of the book. So in the end, and I'll leave you with this, what I call in the book the disappearance or the loss of these secure social locations, that might prove to be a positive outcome for Japanese society. I really think that it might. But Japan has to reach that institutional equilibrium. And in the process of doing so, it will have come at a social cost, and I see it as a social cost that's been principally borne by the young generation. So